So a case challenging the NFA and its restrictions on SBRs is now in front of the Supreme Court. And in this case, the Trump DOJ just responded in a very interesting way. So let's break down what just happened in this Supreme Court case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you guys want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that, of course, is to subscribe to the channel. That helps the channel to grow and tells the algorithm that you appreciate two-way content. And then also just double check to make sure YouTube is not unsubscribed you, because they do that a lot, especially on two-way channels. Now, before we jump into this video, I want to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Silent. Now, let's face it, we all know that our phones and other electronic devices like laptops are actually just tracking devices. Big tech, government agencies, and even cyber criminals, they're all collecting our data, and they're doing that through some of our devices. That's why it's always a good option to maybe look into, Faraday bags and other options, and I highly recommend Silent. Their Faraday gear and these bags and other items you can get block all wireless signals, cellular, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS, and a lot of other signals that, government agencies, hackers, all these people use to get into your devices. I use their backpack every single day when I'm going to and from the office. I put my laptop in there, my phone in there, and then also I use it a lot when I'm going through airports or when I'm staying at hotels, because again, I want to protect those devices and I don't want people to get access to my devices, to my phone, or to my laptop. So again, if you're interested, you can protect your privacy, your freedom, and all of your family and your devices by just simply using a Faraday bag. I highly recommend Silent. You can go to silent.com/scholar and you can get 15% off and a free shipping as well on these products. Again, simply just go to slnt.com/scholar. And again, I will link that all down below in the details section and also in the pinned comment. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be talking about a very important NFA challenge case that is currently in front of the Supreme Court. This case is called U.S. versus Rush, and again, it's a challenge to the NFA and its current restrictions on SBRs. This challenge asks for the Supreme Court to find that the NFA's restrictions on SBRs is in fact unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. Now, the petition also focuses on how the Supreme Court finally needs to step in and correct all this lower court defiance and confusion that's been going on, and all the discussion about what type of arms are protected under the Second Amendment. In this case, the Trump administration originally sent a notice to the Supreme Court waiving their response to the petition, and they said that they would not respond to this NFA case in the Supreme Court unless the Supreme Court ordered them to file a response. Well, the Supreme Court ordered that they file that response, and the Trump DOJ just submitted the response to this petition. In the response of the Trump administration, they argue that the Supreme Court should deny review to this case because they believe the NFA has at least some circumstances where it could be applied in a valid way, and therefore this case should survive a facial challenge. Now, that's some legal, nuance there, but that's one of the main arguments that they make there. But even more interesting, what they also argue in this brief is that the underlying question on whether SBRs are arms and therefore protected by the Second Amendment is a question that should be answered and addressed in a different case, not this one here. The Trump DOJ calls for the Supreme Court to take up a state AR-15 ban, rifle bans, to further outline this topic rather than taking the more nuanced and complex and kind of muddy issues revolving around SBRs. Instead, the Trump DOJ argues that a state rifle ban case would be a better vehicle and a better way to answer the question about what type of arms are protected by the Second Amendment. They argue once the Supreme Court does that, that will give further guidance to other courts on how to handle and address this SBR question. Now, for those not aware, this NFA SBR case revolves around Mr. Rush here being in possession of an unregistered SBR. This case arises out of a situation where in February of 2022, a police officer saw Mr. Rush, who didn't have a driver's license. It was revoked, and the police officer saw Mr. Rush pull into a driveway with his truck, and then he walked out of the driveway there and walked into a courthouse for an appearance. Now, after leaving the courthouse, the individual here, Mr. Rush, then walked, I believe, across the street to a nearby apartment complex and went into a house. And then about an hour later, Mr. Rush's sister left the apartment, got into the truck, and drove away. The police officer then followed the truck and then pulled it over and then talked to the sister, who was the driver, and asked the sister to call Mr. Rush and to have him come to the vehicle. Now, while that was happening, the police officer was looking into the vehicle and he saw what he believed was marijuana in the center console. Because of that, the police officer then searched the rest of the vehicle, and Mr. Rush arrived right when this was happening. And as Mr. Rush got to the truck, he then opened, I believe, the back truck door and then reached to grab an object on the floorboard. Now, after a brief struggle with the police officer, Mr. Rush was then arrested. And then what ended up happening is they found a loaded SBR on the floorboard of that truck. Now, Mr. Rush later admitted that he intended to grab the rifle and then take off running with it. And because of this whole interaction, Mr. Rush was charged with possessing an illegal SBR in violation of the NFA. On review, the district court denied his motion, concluding that SBRs are dangerous and unusual firearms and therefore not protected under the Second Amendment. This then was appealed to the Seventh Circuit, who on review affirmed the district court's decision, relying on the Supreme Court's prior ruling in the case U.S. versus Miller. The Seventh Circuit found that Miller remains controlling precedent and that the NFA's restrictions are consistent with the historical firearms regulations as mentioned in Bruin. In response to all of this, Mr. Rush has now filed his writ of cert to the Supreme Court. Now, Mr. Rush is also supported by the NRA, and the NRA in this petition on behalf of Mr. Rush argues that since the Supreme Court issued Bruin, courts across the country have struggled to answer the many questions resulting from the court's new analytical framework. In particular, the debate as to what constitutes a bearable arm covered by the Second Amendment has revitalized relevance. They argue that this case presents several issues that are dividing lower courts and is a suitable vehicle for the court to clarify what arms the Second Amendment actually protects. Now, like I mentioned, the Trump DOJ originally waived the right to respond to the petition, but the Supreme Court then ordered the Trump DOJ to file a response. Well, the Trump administration recently just filed the response, and they first argued that the petition here should be denied because the NFA is facially constitutional. They argue that there is some valid applications of the NFA to a point where it doesn't fully violate the Second Amendment, and based on that, it should survive a facial challenge. Now, that's some nuance revolving around what the Supreme Court has said about facial challenges, but more importantly here for this case is what the Trump administration argues revolving around these types of arms bans and what they want the Supreme Court to do on clarifying what arms are protected. The Trump DOJ argues that this case is not the proper vehicle for reviewing and essentially deciding what arms are protected under the Second Amendment. They argue instead that the Supreme Court should take up a state rifle ban case to answer that very question. The Trump administration states in the brief that Mr. Rush instead asked this court to grant certiorari to resolve a variety of other analytical issues, such as the meaning of the word arms in the Second Amendment. Some of the questions that petitioner raises may well warrant review in an appropriate case, but this case would be a poor vehicle for addressing those issues. Other types of cases, for instance, they state, cases involving state laws banning AR-15 rifles would provide better vehicles for clarifying the appropriate framework for discerning what types of arms the Second Amendment protects. Based on that, the Trump DOJ in the response asked for the Supreme Court to deny review to this case and potentially instead grant review to a different challenge like an AR-15 rifle ban case. If that's the case, it would be also interesting to see if the United States government and the Trump administration decides to file an amicus brief in maybe a different case that's currently pending and seeking Supreme Court review, like the Viramontes versus Cook County rifle ban case that we've talked about here on the channel. That case is currently pending in front of the Supreme Court and seeking Supreme Court review, and we've seen that the Trump DOJ already in the past has done something similar in supporting one of these rifle ban cases, like the ones in the Seventh Circuit dealing with Pica. And even in that challenge in the Seventh Circuit, the Trump administration and Harmeet Dillon actually joined in those oral arguments to argue against the state of Illinois' bans on rifles and magazines. So again, a very important challenge that's now moving forward in the Supreme Court. The Trump administration filed the response arguing that the petition should be denied, but then they also argued that the Supreme Court needs to take review and address these other questions revolving around arms in something like a state AR-15 rifle ban case. So this is very interesting. We're going to see how this develops and how this moves forward. As we get more information, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that, of course, is to subscribe to the channel. But as always, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.